Okay, welcome to the Jackson Hole China Forum. This is a Friday, and I'm so glad you can make it on Friday, and especially beautiful weather outside. Normally, I start to thank Bill Jackson and Diana Lee for helping the China Forum. Today, I want to make special thanks to Diana Lee for bringing Mr. Bruce Wharton to Denver, because they know each other very well. And it's my distinctive pleasure today to welcome Mr. Bruce Wharton from Washington, D.C., from the State Department to Denver, to our university. Hopefully we'll have some chance to see the beautiful campus here, and to our Jackson Hole China Forum. Bruce is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy in the Bureau of Africa. And he also served in many offices. I don't think I want to read it. You have. And also in many other countries, in the U.S. embassies and offices. He has worked on Africa-U.S. relations. But his job has brought him to a lot of interactions with the Chinese involvement in Africa. So he will talk about U.S., China, and Africa interactions in a very broad perspective. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Mr. Wharton.
Second, Professor Zhao's thanks to all of you for being inside on such a beautiful day. It's really reassuring to know that there are people like you all interested in Africa and in China and in how the United States and Africa and China are sort of trying to build a productive future together. But I'm especially grateful to Dr. Zhao and the center here at the University of Denver for inviting me to come out to the university to speak. Colorado, for a number of reasons, has long been a favorite state, both geographic and psychological for me, so I'm really grateful for such a good reason to come back here again. Some of you may have seen my bio, but in the interests of transparency and self-protection, I have to make clear that I am not a China hand. I am not a China expert. Even though my father-in-law told me at least 20 years ago that I really should focus on China, that my foreign service career would be greatly enhanced by that. I think he saw the dragoning awakening before a lot of others did. My foreign service career has been spent in Latin American and African affairs. Now, broadly defined, my responsibilities today are to guide U.S. government engagement with the people of Africa. That includes a wide range of educational and professional exchanges, training initiatives, information and library programs, English language instruction, media activities, and a host of other public programs. So my core expertise really is in understanding the public sphere, the marketplace of ideas, and how the United States can engage the people of Africa to advance our national policy concerns and our national security. But like everybody else who's much engaged in Africa these days, I am very much interested in thinking about how China's expanding role on the continent affects African and U.S. interests there. So that's what I'll talk about this afternoon. And I'll speak for about 20-25 minutes and then look forward to having a conversation with you all. I also need to point out, though, that I'm exceedingly lucky to be working for one of the most accomplished Africanists in the U.S. government. That's Assistant Secretary Johnny Carson. With a career that began as a Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania in 1965, 3 ambassadorships in Africa, and having been handpicked by Secretary Clinton to lead U.S. policy towards Africa, Ambassador Carson has an exceptional depth and breadth of knowledge of Africa. And I'm indebted to him for his leadership and for some of the substance of these remarks, which I've drawn in part from a talk that he gave last November. So credit where credit is due. Now, a lot of my time in Washington is consumed by issues of immediate concern. the urgent often overcomes the important in Washington. So the chance to consider and discuss with people like you these long-term strategic topics is an opportunity of great value. I do look forward to that conversation with you, and I'm certain that I will learn from all of you. And events like this are an important part of the policy-making process. Your analysis, your ideas, your suggestions can help me do a better job of guiding our strategic planning and program implementation in Africa. A little bit of context and history. Without question, one of the most significant developments in Africa over the past decade has been the rapid growth of Chinese trade, investment, and diplomatic outreach. Modern China's initial presence in Africa blossomed in the 1960s as it pursued ties with the newly independent African governments and the liberation movements with which it shared common interests. However, aside from a handful of noteworthy projects, such as the Tanzania-Zambia Railroad, the commercial dimension of China's involvement was limited. From the 1960s through the 1980s, China's top priority in Africa was centered on establishing full diplomatic relations with as many nations as possible and drawing those nations away from recognizing Taiwan. Only as China's economic growth and manufacturing capacity began to accelerate rapidly in the 1990s did its interests broaden and become more commercially focused, particularly in the procurement of energy and mineral resources. Can you all hear me okay in the back?
Maybe a little louder.
A little bit louder? Okay. Now, the change since the 1990s, I'll project to you. The change since the 1990s has really been impressive. In 1997, China-Africa trade was about $5 billion a year. And by 2008, just before the global economic crisis, it had reached about $107 billion a year. There was a slight dip in 2009, but trade has rebounded to $127 billion a year, putting China just ahead of the United States for the first time as Africa's biggest trading partner. Those are 2010 numbers, $127 billion. Now, I don't come from the Wharton School of Economics line of the Wharton family, so the numbers like that are sort of inconceivably large to me. But by way of comparison, and just to sort of put this into context, the GDP of Denver last year, or the same in 2010, was $165 billion. So all of Africa's trade with China, back and forth, 127 billion, compares, it's a, 60-70% of Denver's output. So just sort of keep that in mind in terms of the context and the dimensions of China's involvement in Africa. Now, some press coverage and analysis has, in my view, mistakenly framed China's growing presence in Africa as a great power rivalry between the United States, China, and Africa, as if the Cold War were still on. Our two countries, the United States and China, do have different approaches to and interests on the continent, but I think it's wrong to say that we are in competition for resources and influence. Increased trade and investment is, in fact, in the interest of the United States, which regards Africa's economic growth as a core policy objective. China's contributions to peacekeeping and infrastructure development are also in our interests. Look, Africa is a continent of about 1 billion people. It's 3 times the size of the United States and has an economic potential that is still largely untapped. It could easily accommodate several more Chinas without dislodging those of us who are already there. Unlike many parts of the world, Africa's oil producers are open to foreign investment, and American and European companies remain the dominant players there. In some cases, Chinese and Western energy firms are joint venture partners on oil projects. Chinese firms in other sectors have also entered parts of Africa that U.S. and Western firms have long ago abandoned and continue to ignore, either because they're perceived as too risky or too small a market. China's growth in Africa must also be considered within the larger context of its commercial relations with other countries. As we all know, China has become a major trading partner for the United States and much of the world. The growth in its trade with Africa is impressive, but the overall volume is comparatively modest compared to trade with individual countries such as Korea, Japan, and Germany, each of which is larger than that of the trade with all of Africa combined. No African country ranks among China's top 10 import suppliers or export destinations. Moreover, other economic data, such as direct foreign investment and aid flows from China, are extremely opaque and present a more mixed picture in which OECD countries remain the dominant players. Africa is clearly important for China, and vice versa, but that importance should not be overstated or oversimplified. It's also important to understand China's reach into Africa within the context of major changes in the global economy and changes among Africa's traditional economic partners. The commercial interests of Africa's former European colonial powers have shifted to other regions, such as Asia, over the past 2 decades. Africa's relative importance for Europe has declined as colonial-era relationships fade with the passing of generations and as opportunities elsewhere have grown more attractive. Indeed, despite a lot of hype in the press about Africa's economic growth, the continent's share of global trade of about 3% in 2010 is still well below its peak of 6% in 1980. And Africa's share of global manufacturing is anemic at about 1.1%. Let's try this. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So again, I think it's important to keep the economic dimensions of China in Africa in perspective. Now, collaborative diplomacy has been a cornerstone of the Obama administration's foreign policy, especially in Africa. In practice, this means working closely with our international partners and multilateral institutions on issues of common interest and concern. Historically, these partners have been African countries themselves, Europe, and organizations including the United Nations, the West African Economic Community, and the Southern African Development Community, and the African Union. Now, given China's growing presence in Africa, it's only natural that the United States and Africa begin to engage in a regular dialogue and identify potential opportunities for collaboration on African issues. In 2010, we hosted a Chinese delegation in Washington, and the Chinese reciprocated in November of last year when Assistant Secretary Carson led a delegation to Beijing. The next meeting, in fact, will take place next month in Washington. Now, these annual exchanges provide a high-level opportunity for us to share information about our interests and programs in Africa and to look for possible cooperative ventures. And similar dialogues are occurring between many of our embassies, our respective embassies, in a number of African countries. In Liberia, for example, we've been able to collaborate with Chinese counterparts on some health and development initiatives. And in response to the drought and food crisis in the Horn of Africa last year, China donated about $90 million for humanitarian assistance. There's also been some cooperation between our nations in combating piracy off the coast of Somalia. So these are modest first steps, but they're significant ones given that no such dialogue or collaboration occurred in the past. And we see opportunities for greater cooperation, particularly in areas such as health and agriculture. But acting on these opportunities and implementing meaningful initiatives will take considerable effort on both sides. Now let me make a few points regarding some of the real and perceived differences between our interests in Africa and those of China. Since the beginning of the Obama administration, our Africa policy has been framed around 5 overarching priorities. First, strengthening democratic institutions, civil society, and the rule of law. Second, assisting in the prevention and mitigation and resolution of conflicts. Third, encouraging long-term equitable development and growth, including food security. Fourth, enhancing access to quality health care and education. And fifth, working with Africans to address transnational issues, including terrorism, maritime security, climate change, narcotics trafficking in persons, and a whole host of other issues that transcend national boundaries. On democracy and governance, the United States is unapologetic in supporting a majority of Africans in their quest for democracy and human rights, even if our efforts in this area are sometimes castigated as a violation of sovereignty by those seeking to tightly control political space. We believe that democracy is the only path to long-term stability and economic growth in Africa. And I think this view is supported by the fact that most conflict, instability, and state failure in Africa to date has been preceded by authoritarianism and disregard for the rule of law. Now, because of its own tragic experience with foreign meddling, China follows a non-interventionist policy in which it seeks good relations with any government, regardless of that government's record on democracy and human rights. Although this approach may limit the international community's ability to isolate some regimes politically and economically, it should not be misconstrued as obstructionist. China adapts very quickly to political change and embraces new governments as they emerge, even when the new governments displace governments with which China previously had good relations. Formal recognition of Taiwan, which is today limited to only a few minor states, appears to be the only major red line for Chinese engagement. On mitigating conflict, through the billions of dollars that the United States contributes in annual assessed obligations to the United Nations, through our financial support and training of African peacekeeping, through humanitarian relief and diplomacy, our country has historically played a very important role in conflict mitigation in Africa. China, thus far, has not been a major player, except for its relatively limited participation in UN peacekeeping missions, spread across about 1,500 troops spread across several different missions in Africa, and in China's contributions to UN policies as a veto member of the Security Council. The U.S. approach to conflict mitigation also includes measures often perceived as interventionist, such as economic sanctions and trials for those accused of war crimes and other abuses. Now, outside of a few exceptions, such as Sudan and Zimbabwe, China's provision of military training and sale of affordable weapons to African governments can play a positive role in helping, at least in principle, to build security capacity. U.S. strategies for enhancing economic growth and development are focused mostly on policy reforms that can reduce corruption, on clearing obstacles to trade and investment, and on enhancing the rule of law and the sanctity of contracts. Most of our financial assistance for economic growth is channeled through the Millennium Challenge Corporation and is thereby conditioned on satisfying economic and political governance benchmarks. U.S. economic policies and diplomacy in Africa are not designed, frankly, to facilitate access for private U.S. firms, which by and large must fend for themselves unless their deals are eligible for financing through the Exim Bank, and even that is very limited. U.S. firms are also subject by law and by their shareholders to some of the most stringent environmental, labor, and ethical and legal standards in the world, regardless of what might be permitted in Africa. We believe that the Chinese approach to Africa has in some cases undermined efforts to promote progressive business practices, democracy, and good governance. Although China enacted legislation in 2011 that criminalizes bribery of foreign public officials, some Chinese companies continue to undermine accountability and good governance by engaging in corrupt practices to win contracts in Africa. Corrupt activity by Chinese companies disadvantages U.S. companies who compete on the merits and do not engage in such illegal behavior, which is prohibited under domestic bribery laws in Africa, as well as by the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The United States encourages China to rigorously enforce its anti-bribery laws, to accede to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, and to subscribe to international development practices. We will also urge African leaders to hold China and other international partners accountable for adherence to national and international standards and regulations. Finally, some Chinese companies either refuse to hire local labor or limit such hiring, preferring to bring in labor, skills, and sometimes even raw materials from China. And these practices do little to build local capacity or create local employment. As pointed out in virtually every article and book on this subject, China's economic approach to Africa is focused primarily on facilitating access to markets and to mineral and energy deposits. Now, as part of that bargain, African governments receive billions of dollars in lines of credit which can be used to finance large-scale infrastructure projects that are almost always contracted to Chinese firms. This approach, in principle, allows for rapid delivery of roads, dams, power plants, and railroads that otherwise might never happen with more frugal and stringent Western donors. But having been complicit in Africa's previous debt binge in the 1970s, the United States is wary of that cycle repeating itself, especially if the commodity boom cools down and the debt burden is found once again to be unsustainable. The sustainability and long-term economic viability of some projects themselves also require careful scrutiny. On health, about half of our approximately $9 billion in total assistance to Africa in 2010, including Millennium Challenge Compacts, went to fighting infectious diseases through the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, and the Global Health Initiative, GHI. Now, China has provided health care for millions of Africans since the 1960s through the deployment of mobile health teams. The U.S. programs are keeping millions of people alive right now and preventing millions more from becoming infected. So although the Chinese programs are on a smaller scale than ours, they have that approach, their approach, has been perceived as popular and effective. On transnational issues, I really don't have the time to go into all of the policies and programs that fall within that category. Although China may be engaged on some of the issues, it is by and large a minor player on most. Counterterrorism and counter-narcotics in Africa are of great concern to the United States and our European partners, but these issues do not appear to directly affect China, so one would therefore not expect much of a related policy for Africa. As a final point, I must say that we've got to recognize that the Africans are not passive actors in this. China is not responsible for Africa's afflictions, whether that's authoritarianism, corruption, poverty, conflict, or lax protection of the environment. Individual Chinese firms and other entities may seek to exploit or profit from those afflictions, but ultimately it is the Africans who must establish their own standards in areas such as governance, transparency, environment, and labor. And we should not forget that other actors, including some from the West, do not always adhere to the high standards that are often presumed of them. So China is clearly in the process of some of the most rapid economic and social change the world has ever seen. And our two countries are economically interwoven. It is absolutely in our respective national interests to find as many ways as possible to work together. And Africa is one region that has great potential for us to do so. Let me close with what Secretary Clinton said about China in a speech that she gave just about a month ago. She said, We, the United States, we are a country that welcomes others' success because we believe that it's good for everyone when people anywhere are able to work their way to better lives. If China's rise means that we have an increasingly capable and engaged partner, that's good news for us. So thank you again for hosting me. I look forward to your comments and questions.
So the speech so far is on the record.
Yeah, we're going to do Chatham House rules.
Right. So now I hope everything is off record. So hopefully we can have a more discussion and kind of discussion. Okay, I see the hand. So to be brief, identify yourself so Bruce will know who you are, and also end with a question mark. That's the way the rule here is. Okay.
I'm Brooke Banbury. We've traveled in Africa and I've done business in China. In Africa, we have seen great construction projects. Like in Tunisia, they're building virtually a city. All the signs and everything are in Chinese. But what concerns me the most is acquisition of farmland in Africa by the Chinese, by others. But I don't think in the Omo Valley, I believe they're buying large tracts of land and the water that goes with them. The governments sell it to them and kick people off. Is that a growing problem? And do you see that as a problem in the future?
I think it's something that we've got to pay attention to. I do not have a firm grasp of the dimensions of that problem at this point. I can tell you that there was a lot of concern. I saw some news articles about a major Chinese purchase of land in Mozambique that in fact turned out not to be true. It was a deal that somebody had talked about at some point, but it was never brought to fruition. And recently, within the last 2 years at least, the government of Tanzania decided not to approve a big land deal for the Chinese in Tanzania. Land is a very precious commodity for many Africans. There's a lot of cultural identity wrapped up with land ownership and where your ancestors are buried, that sort of thing. So I think that the Chinese, or rather the Africans, many Africans are wary of it. I've also heard about the Omo Valley I guess that's in Ethiopia. Again, I'm not quite sure what the dimensions of the challenge are. I can tell you this, though, that 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land is in Africa. So there's tremendous potential there. And it's not just the Chinese who are interested. The Indians are interested. The Saudis are interested. And both of those companies from both of those countries are buying land in Africa. So I think the bottom line is it needs to be managed, it needs to be watched closely so that Africans get full advantage of it. But there is tremendous opportunity there.
Okay, this side.
Thank you. My name is, excuse me, Robert Fogler. I teach a course here at Corbell on capital markets in Africa. For the past 8 years, I've managed a venture capital fund investing in Africa, and I have run a TV broadcast media company operating in about 25 countries in Africa. We've worked a lot with government officials in Africa, and we've done business deals with Chinese firms in Africa as well. My concern from a U.S. interest perspective is that my experience is that outside the extractive industries, the United States is many years behind China when it comes to competence of doing business in Africa's frontier markets. And that's not related to corruption stuff, but just efficiently getting things done and doing business. And my sense is that we're falling even further behind. We've seen a lot of changes over the past 8 to 10 years even.
Yeah.
Right now in Africa, the phrase, "I'm here from America and I'm here to do business," will open almost any door, both in government and private sector. But that won't last if we're called to account on the fact that we're not really following through and getting things done the way Chinese firms are when you look around with construction, with technology, transfer, and other things. So is there anything, when I hear you talk about the U.S. priorities for Africa, Exim Bank is small, OPIC very small, not particularly serious when it comes to private sector. Well, I understand the private sector has to fend for itself. My fear is that without an American policy that is somehow aligned with pushing American business interests into Africa, will fall hopelessly behind.
Fundamentally, I agree with your analysis of the situation. Don't disagree. I think there are several reasons why American business has not been as aggressive in Africa as we would like. And part of those reasons are the responsibility of people like me. I think that we need to do a better job of making sure that American business knows what opportunities exist in Africa. And I think we need to do a better job of working with African partners, governments, to try to make sure that the playing field is as level as possible. And that's a job of long-term institution building, strong systems of justice, reducing corruption, that sort of thing. But on the first part of the equation, the responsibility we have to sort of help American business see what they might do in Africa, we've seized that one by the horns. My boss, Assistant Secretary Carson, led the first big trade delegation to Africa that the United States has had for a long time in March. And it was focused on energy primarily. And we had a great turnout, a lot of interest. Symbion, ExxonMobil, Anadarko, Chevron. There are 7 or 8 pretty significant players who went on that trip. And the focus was on African countries that have energy needs. This is a real bottleneck for Africa, the electric power. You probably know this better than I do, but something like 80% of the power consumed on the continent is consumed in the form of burning firewood and charcoal. I think that all of Africa probably produces less power than one good-sized American city. Power is expensive in Africa, it's unreliable, and it's hard to get. So we're focusing on that as a place where American firms can do some real good and make some money while they're doing it. We'll lead another trade delegation probably in September that's going to be focused more on infrastructure development. And it's unusual for the State Department to lead trade delegations. This is Chatham House rules, right? Yeah. That is to say, I'm off the record. The Department of Commerce is supposed to do that. That is the mission of the Department of Commerce, is to promote American business and services abroad. They're not doing it. They're in fact reducing their presence in Africa right now, rather than increasing it. So we're doing the best we can to kind of step into that breach and try to help people like you and your colleagues see the opportunities and then have a decent competitive environment in which to work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, here first.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Mr. Wharton.
Good evening.
My name is Xiaowen Xu, goes by Mary. I'm from China, and I studied in USA, and I'll go to Africa this winter, so maybe this is the reason why I came here.
Good.
From the information I read from the email. So anyway, I learned that you have spent some time in Tanzania, Africa. This is a place I'll go this winter. So if you could provide any information, I would appreciate it. I know it's kind of a big question, but I appreciate it.
Will you be in Dar es Salaam or somewhere else, Arusha, or where will you be in the country?
Maybe so. It's kind of.
It's a beautiful country. It's one of the amazing things about Tanzania is that the Tanzanians have done a better job of overcoming ethnic and tribal divisions than some other African nations. You know, it wasn't the Africans who decided the borders of their countries. It was a bunch of dead white guys in Berlin in 1886 or 87 who drew the boundaries of those countries. And so there was a lot of different people were sort of jammed together in the same geopolitical space. But the first leader that Tanzania had after independence was a man named Julius Nyerere, thank you, Mwalimu, the teacher. And he brought Tanzania together, partly using language, making sure that Kiswahili was the language that everybody spoke. And he made some economic mistakes, which he later acknowledged. He pursued a sort of a socialist utopia model that did not work well in Tanzania. But it's at this point a very peaceful, very progressive, very unified country. So I think you'll enjoy it.
Okay, so
One more question.
no.
But we need to move on.
Yeah, we have some more people too. He's from the mayor's office, working on the trade with all over the world.
Great.
My name is Abdul Sise. I Mayor's Office of Economic Development. I am originally from Sierra Leone, West Africa, and I head in the International Programs Office and work with China. I also studied in China. My question is, due to failures in leadership in Africa in the 1970s, the U.S. and most Western countries decided that the new model for development was to divert aid from the African governments to NGOs, the non-governmental organizations. Now, it's common knowledge that NGOs are not accountable to anyone. Now that African countries are beginning to have stable leadership and democracy is taking root in a number of African countries, is the U.S. And the State Department rethinking this method of delivering aid to African countries, instead of giving it to NGOs, working directly with African governments to make sure that they then are able to leverage the aid to get the African governments to do things that are of importance to the U.S.?
Yes, in fact we are. This is a very important point, though. We have inadvertently set up a lot of conflict between civil society and governments through some of our aid policies. And you're right. Corruption in government made it very difficult for us to deliver aid directly to governments. But the Millennium Challenge Corporation works with governments. And in essence, a country is eligible for a Millennium Challenge agreement or grant if they meet certain benchmarks in economic transparency, in democratic process, in basic civil liberties. And those aren't benchmarks that the United States devises. We use benchmarks that are set by international organizations such as Freedom House on media issues. And it's all very clear. I mean, people criticize it for being development assistance by report card, but in fact, it makes sense, I think, to connect good governance practice and good economic practice to the delivery of large amounts of foreign aid. So that's how we're sort of getting back into working directly with governments.
Okay, here.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Shimelis Asafa. I'm a faculty here in the Mortgage College of Education, originally from Ethiopia. I have two sets of questions. I think either you can answer it in your current capacity or as an expert, taking yourself out of your current capacity. I say that because I really need a very candid answer. The first question has to do, if you can talk about a little bit in terms of your office's activity in education, information, and libraries in Africa. The second is, I think, although my area is information science, information technology, but since when I was in Ethiopia, I do follow international events. I read all kinds of things, and I follow international affairs. When it comes to Africa, do you see really essentially any difference between China and the United States? Although on paper, I can, align myself to the U.S.'s position, especially given the 5 areas you mentioned: the democratic institutions, good governance, conflict resolutions, right? But when these things are not going well, I see. I can talk about Ethiopia. I don't know for other countries, but I think from my readings, I can also speak about Egypt, for instance. Sometimes it puzzles me why the U.S. is keeping silent. If for China, Taiwan, or market or resources are red lines, which are interest, right? And if the U.S. has also interest with Ethiopia in terms of probably vis-a-vis the Horn of Africa, Somalia, and what have you. But in the recent election in 2005, for instance, where hundreds of young kids as young as 10 were, slaughtered on the street just for asking their basic, human right demands. And I think my point again is I've never heard a senior official or even, someone in the desk of Africa talking about why Africa is doing this, as outside of the, State Department reports that are coming out every year.
Yeah. Let me take a shot at sort of answering both of those quickly, and maybe we can speak afterwards. On the work that I do, engaging African publics, I think it's instructive for me to remember that when I joined the Foreign Service in 1985, there were 2 functioning democracies in Africa, Botswana and Mauritius. Today, I couldn't give you a quick number, but it's got to be on the order of 24. And again, the definition of functioning democracy is open to debate, but clearly there's been a huge amount of progress in democratic governance in Africa in the last 25, 27 years. So, with that as the starting point, then, and if we truly believe that democracies are governments that listen to and serve the citizens, then we need to listen to and influence the citizens. I mean, so the work that I try to do, which is Fulbright programs, for example, to help Africans become more expert at their field, or providing information to high school students or college students through libraries and information centers. That's all aimed at helping African publics make informed decisions about the future that they want for their country. So that's why I think the work is important. Our relationship with Ethiopia is very complex. We need Ethiopia for security reasons, and we have a very robust security relationship with Ethiopia. For all of its civil rights problems, Ethiopia plays a very constructive role in maintaining some form of stability. I think that by some measures, Ethiopia is better off today than it was 20 years ago. We speak openly to President Melesh about our concerns about clamping down on political space and freedom of expression. And I think by and large we have a pretty good record of doing that, even with countries that we consider friends. Uganda, for example, we've been very public about our criticism of the authoritarian tendencies of President Museveni. But diplomacy is an art, and it's an art of compromise, and it's not always possible to pursue the pure principles that you wish you could.
Okay, our student from Africa, he's organizing
Côte
a
d'Ivoire.
conference.
I like your president very much.
Yeah, he's organizing a conference.
No, from Ghana. I like him too. He was with my president not too long ago.
Yeah. My name is Issa Muhammad. I'm from Ghana, of course, and I belong to the Students for Africa here at Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. My questions are two-part. Well, let me do a shameless plug. In May, we'll be talking about Africa's development here, May 10 and 11. But my two questions are, how has the State Department's policy towards Africa changed because of China's presence in Africa? Has there been an essential shift from one way of looking at Africa to, or engaging Africa to the other? And my second question is, has the State Department looked at Africans in the diaspora in helping shape this policy and engaging the United States with Africa?
Great questions. I don't think our policy has changed radically because of China's growing presence in Africa. We really bring different things to Africa. The United States has, for the last 25 or 30 years, focused more on human capacity development in Africa. And the Chinese have focused more on infrastructure development. Both of those things are useful and important, but they're complementary. And, the Africans need to play both sides against the middle to the best advantage to the people of Africa. The exception, though, I think, is our more recent recognition that we've got to do a better job of competing with Chinese companies for contracts and for business and for market access. And that's why Ambassador Carson led this trade delegation in March or February, whatever it was, That's why we're planning another one in September. I'm actually going to Brazil a week from now to talk to the Brazilians about some sort of trilateral work between Brazil, the United States, and African countries. So we're taking a look, taking a look at how we can better compete with the Chinese. But our fundamental policy concerns have not changed much. Your second question was, the diaspora. Yes, absolutely. Some diasporas are easier to work with than others. I've spent a lot of time working with the Somali diaspora. Somalia is so chaotic. We don't have an embassy there. And so for me to be able to try to shape attitudes and influence events in Somalia, the only way I can really do it is through people who live in Minneapolis and Columbus and London. In fact, I was at a conference 2 weeks ago in London with members of the Somali diaspora from that country. We meet regularly, though, there are a lot of organizations. The Ghanaian organization is pretty strong in Washington. Kenyans are quite strong. Cameroonians are really strong. I don't know why, but they're very well organized. So yeah, we talk to them all the time.
Well, the reason I asked that is because when you look at the numbers last year, with respect to foreign direct investment into Africa, what was coming from the diaspora was almost as much as what foreign direct investment was. It was looking at about, I think, close to 60 billion coming from the diaspora into Africa. And I think that there has to be a way to be able to leverage that to how the governments of Africa do things that will promote development for Africans.
Yeah, that's a tough one, though, because I would not be in favor of channeling those remittances through governments, because I'd be afraid that a lot of it would disappear. But I do think that your fundamental point, which is trying to make the best use of that huge amount of money, is right. But most of it, of course, goes from individual to individual, and so it gets spent on food and school fees and that sort of thing.
Okay, and
Andy.
Hi, I'm Andy Koss. I'm a retired State Department officer, former colleague of Bruce. Bruce, you talked a little bit about your own public diplomacy efforts, Fulbright programs, information centers. What about the Chinese efforts in that regard, Confucius centers, things like that? Do you see them, are they active, and do you see them as complementary or as kind of competitive?
I view them as friendly competitors. I think that they offer things. I think it would be great if my children learned to speak Chinese, quite honestly. I have no problem with that. So I'm not going to stand in the way of any African person who wishes to learn Chinese. I think that's a good thing. And that's the main thing that I think the Confucius centers do in Africa, is provide language instruction. But yeah, I think there's some friendly competition there for, how many students do you have enrolled in your classes right now? We would like for kids to speak English. But I think we're sort of coming at it from different directions, and I don't see a direct head-to-head or certainly an ideological competition between the United States and China on those cultural centers.
okay. Here, we try to.
I'm interested in issues of accountability. And you mentioned before about in the health sector that the Chinese programs, the targeted Chinese programs, were effective. And then you also
perceived as effective.
Perceived.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that is to say that people like them. You go into a village and they say, "Oh, yes, the Chinese doctors were here and they were really nice," and so that's good. But in terms of sort of epidemiological output, I think that the programs that we offer have been substantially more important. Yeah.
Okay, here.
You haven't mentioned the ones we hear the most about is South Africa and Nigeria, and just wondered if you could make a few observations there.
Well, you just named the two most important countries on the continent. Nigeria is the single most important country, 160 million people, biggest population. A lot of our oil comes from there, something like 15 to 18%, I think. And a country which, when I think about the dead white guys in Berlin drawing the map of Africa, Nigeria is one of the places that was most or was least well served by that geography exercise. It's an extraordinary place. I don't know if you've ever been there, but the human energy, the intellectual capital in Nigeria is just, it's overwhelming. And if the people of Nigeria ever came to common cause, the rest of the world would fall helpless before them. But that's not going to happen. The internal divisions are pretty deep. The election of 2011, which brought the wonderfully named President Goodluck Jonathan to power, were a substantial improvement over the elections of 2007. But it's a southern-dominated government which has ignored the North, ignored development in the North at its peril. There's currently a violent group called Boko Haram that's blowing things up and killing people in northern Nigeria, and we believe that the fundamental response to that needs to be a response of social justice, economic development. And so far, the Nigerian response has been too heavy on the security response, sending up police officers and soldiers. And they're not going to shoot their way out of this problem. They need to develop the North. South Africa is one of my favorite places on the planet. I was there for the first 4 years of democracy, and it was an extraordinary privilege to watch that country make this miraculous change from minority rule to majority rule. I think that South Africa faces massive problems in the future in the form of an uneducated and alienated youth population. 15% of South Africans who enter high school graduate from high school. So they're failing to produce people who will competently be able to take part in modern economies, and that's a big problem.
Okay, last two questions here. You got one.
My question, I'm Dutch Cruz from the Anthropology Department. I work in Mozambique and I work mostly in rural areas. And I've been working in Mozambique since 2004, so it has been quite clear for me the importance of the Chinese presence, particularly like you were mentioning, building infrastructures. Yeah. Last time I was in Mozambique, which was 2010, one of the problems that was clear and everybody was talking about it was the fact that very few Mozambicans were being hired by the Chinese companies.
Right.
And another problem was kind of bordering actually the human rights issues, which was the misunderstanding between Chinese and the fewer Mozambican workers. For example, the fact that people needed 4 or 5 days to go to a funeral, and there were incidences of even violence. Yep. And I was wondering if you have thought about some of these issues, if they have been addressed.
When I think about the future of China in Africa, I have a lot of faith that the people of Africa will decide how they want to deal with the rest of the world, including with China. I think that issues of racism and cultural conflict are sort of an unspoken but fairly important part of the relationship between China and Africa. In my observation, the Chinese in Africa tend to live in fairly tightly managed enclaves. They don't mix much. And they don't always treat people as well as I hope we treat people, and we fail sometimes as well. The West has a long record of racism and poor treatment of local populations. But, recently there have been news stories about a mine in Zambia where workers were pretty badly mistreated, and the Chinese, I think, have understood, at least in that case, that they've got to change their management practices, that they've got to find ways to sort of bridge the gap between Chinese cultural expectations and African cultural expectations. The other thing I'll mention is the long-term effect of some of these infrastructure projects. I was in Kinshasa a year and a half ago, and the Chinese had just come through and built they'd repaved all the roads in downtown Kinshasa. And the roads were very smooth, but they cut down these gorgeous 150-year-old trees that used to line the avenues of Kinshasa and make it a gracious and beautiful city. They cut them down so that they could make the roads wider. And people were angry. I mean, the people in Kinshasa were angry that this had happened. And it was weird to see Chinese workers, digging ditches, and lots of unemployed Congolese people. Second example is from Addis Ababa, where the Chinese have just finished a $160 million headquarters building for the African Union. It's a beautiful building. They employed no African workers when they built that. The United States, a year and a half ago, finished a $60 million embassy building. Not quite as beautiful as the African Union building, but serviceable. Most of the workers on our project were Ethiopian workers. And not only did we employ just the basic laborers, but we trained people. We trained people to pour concrete and bend rebar and do electricity. And so not only did we employ a lot of people over the 3 years it took to build that building, but there was a big skill transfer that went with it. Africans notice these things. And over time, either the Chinese will change the way they deal with Africans, or they will find themselves not very welcome.
Okay, last question from here.
Yes. My name is Papa Dia. I'm the president of the African Leadership Group in Colorado, and I'm originally from Senegal. My question is, I just wanted to know, are there any conversation now with other countries that are helping Africa, with the African leaders about setting expectation as far at some point this African country will need to self-sustain themselves, because most of the African countries have had their independence for more than 40 years, and we tend to see the same pattern. Just wanted to see, are there any conversation with the African leaders to the point where at some point you need to be on the other side as far helping instead of just getting?
I think that conversation is taking place primarily within the African Union. And the African Union, of course, is the UN organization body that represents Africa and has a lot of contact with other nations. We have an ambassador to the African Union, so a lot of those conversations take place there. The other thing, though, to keep in mind is the generation change that's going on. We're just now at the very end of that first generation or second generation of African leaders who came out of a very different background. Congratulations on your new president, on President Sall. He is a different generation than President Wade, and he's already, I think, taking steps to make sure that sort of strong man, that big man of Africa dynamic changes. He's reduced the service, the term that a president will serve in Senegal from 7 years to 5 years. So I think that younger Africans, people like you and a little bit older and a little bit younger, understand what needs to change and are making those changes.
Thank you. Okay, with that note, let's conclude this session. Before we thank Mr. Wharton again, I want to mention that we have quite a few events lined up for next couple of months. Our next event is next Tuesday. We have a congressman from Illinois. He's also the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee's Asia Pacific Subcommittee chairman. So he will come to talk about China-U.S. relationship and also in the context of greater regional issues. And then on the 17th, we have another speaker, Mr. Dan Wright. He worked for the Secretary Hunt Paulson. He was Secretary of Treasury. And Dan Wright worked as his point person working on U.S.-China strategic economic dialogue. So he will come to talk about China-U.S. relationship, I think mostly from economic perspective, because he's now, as all those retired, political appointees that government, what they can do, consulting. And doing consulting companies. Then we have our annual conference. In fact, we have forms in the back to sign up for our annual conference. This year's annual conference is jointly hosted by Zhejiang University and the Cha Institute in Beijing. Cha Institute is this at first. or only non-governmental foreign policy think tank in China. And the topic of the conference is beyond history, reconciliation and sources of conflict between China and its neighboring countries. So we have scholars from China, from Japan, from India, from South Korea, Hong Kong, and of course from Canada and the US to present and discuss the issues. So hopefully you can join us. We have a dinner speaker, former US ambassador to Malaysia, James Keith. I think quite a few people, you must all know him. And so he will talk about his view, because he was not in China. He was China hand, but he's not in China. So we'll talk broader issue of China-US relations. Then the last event for this quarter in May is former chairman of the Taiwan's Foreign Ministry's Policy Planning and Designing Committee. He will come talk about China-Taiwan relations, maybe also China-US-Taiwan relations. So hopefully you will look for our announcements. And also if you are not on our mailing list, we have sign up forms. You can sign up your email addresses to receive our announcements. Especially for the conference, we have conference assignment forms. Okay, thank you for coming, and please join me again to thank Mr. Wharton for such a wonderful. If you have any issues, want to talk to you very briefly.